The first topic we're going to address today is decentralized trials. I thought that would be a wonderful place to start because of what all of us have been through in the past year of dealing with this, especially those folks who work on clinical studies and were greatly impacted by it. So my first statement is going to be this: decentralized trials will create less work for everyone involved in clinical trials. Let's see what our panel thinks about that one. Yes, I have Rebecca sort of agreeing and the other two saying not so fast. Let's hold up a little bit. Chris, why don't we go ahead and start with you? I think one of the issues here is anytime we come out with a new technology, I feel like in some ways or in some areas it creates less work, but then there's also other areas where maybe it creates more work or is more of a hassle than maybe we anticipated. What are your thoughts on that, and what did you see last year when that pandemic was going on?
Yeah, we had to actually go to a decentralized model basically, and my concern is we're now in the process of putting together an NDA. And one of the big findings, it's actually one of the top 3 findings that the FDA inspectors come up with, is successful management of the IP investigational product. And being remote and decentralized and not having the CRAs being able to get on site specifically is causing a little bit of fear for me personally as we try to prepare for audits by the agency. So that's just one example of not having hands-on. I know there are definitely some benefits to it. Another downside is we often hear from sponsors and not sponsors, from sites, is we'd like to be paid more money, because when you're not coming on site and you're using these tools to monitor you take more of the site time. And in reality, probably the site should be compensated for that, because if the CRA is on site and can look at all the stuff and not using, quote, the fancy tools and the slick shiny objects, they can get a hands-on approach where you don't have to use the site resources to dig that stuff up. So I'm going to stop there and let my other 2 colleagues jump in.
So I definitely have a thought on that. Is so I answered, I agree from the patient's perspective, because of course in research we're doing everything for the patient. So I think a decentralized trial is much less work for the patient. For the site, it is a tremendous amount of work. Now, during COVID, it's been more work. Now, a complete decentralized trial where there's maybe 10 sites across the state, the country, and maybe a CRO is managing kind of the coordinating aspect. There's very little work on the site, but then you don't really need the site. But from a decentralized, like hybrid decentralized, where we're doing remote monitoring visits, it's a tremendous amount of work. And I would agree that the site should be reimbursed more for this monitoring visit. Sorry, Chris.
I just have to say, last year when the pandemic hit sometime in March, it seems, every sponsor company who had not adopted decentralized trials for many years, even though they had the opportunity to do that, were suddenly scrambling to make their trials more virtual or decentralized. And I'm sure for the patients that was great. They didn't want to have to leave their homes or go to clinics and be exposed to COVID or other patients that happen to be there. But for the sites, I feel you were just caught in the crossfire there. I mean, even if these things would at some point lead to less work for sites, it certainly seems like the workload was made greater, because if you have a site that had not worked on this type of trial in the past, it seems like you had a huge learning curve you had to go through at the same time that you were putting these technologies in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest hurdle was really, or just time constraints, the monitoring visit. So any piece of paper that the monitor had to review remotely, we had to scan that and upload it to some sort of platform, whether it's our own platform or a sponsor platform. IP, trying to do WebExes and showing the IP. And so whereas a monitoring visit where normally the monitors come on site and we had to, touch with them throughout the day, we are having to spend numerous hours prior to the monitoring visit and then during the monitoring visit uploading all these documentation. So it's a lot of time, and that time we could have been doing something else. So that's why from the site we want reimbursement for that, because the time is.
And Sam, what about from the CRO side? What are your thoughts about when something like this happens and all of a sudden people are scrambling for new technologies? It certainly seems like CROs play a huge role in that.
They play a huge role. That's why I almost need a neutral paddle here, because I agree with comments that are being said by both Chris and Rebecca. Looking at the question and whether or not I think that it decreases the workload, I think it just changes the workload. And I think, Rebecca, your examples were exactly on point with that. And I think with that comes some extra costs that have to be considered as well.
I just want to bounce this off of you. A couple of years ago, I was talking to somebody from a sponsor company about decentralized trials, and she was talking about how great they were and how things were working, and made the comment, maybe at some point we won't need CROs anymore. So shortly after that, I did a follow-up article with a CRO, actually somebody from one of your former companies, who said, no, the CRO will never go away, but mentioned what you just did, that the work they do may end up changing. If some people have their way and all trials eventually become decentralized, how specifically do you see that role of the CRO changing?
So CROs, as you said, I do not think they're going to go away. We're always going to have a need for that expertise and that network and the ability to help sponsors and sites with trials. Now, the way that I think we're going to see the industry change, I think you're going to see a lot more, I call it hyper specialization within the CRO industry. We see pieces of what typically a holistic CRO, full service CRO would have done. Pieces of that are now coming off, and you see those functions being handled by other companies. I think that is one way we're going to see that technology help change the industry.
And Rebecca, I'm really curious about the visits that CRAs would pay to sites. During COVID, I imagine that had to change. Were you still meeting CROs and CRAs on site, or did that move off site, or did they move to Zoom calls? What kind of changes did you see there?
So when COVID first started happening, there was no monitors on site. Now, obviously, COVID is still around, and there's some sponsors allow the monitors to come on site, and some are still, believe it or not, remote. So we have some studies that in the last 15 or so months, we haven't had a CRO or a CRA on site, and now we're having closeout visits, and so there still hasn't been a CRA on site. So seeing a lot of that. I want to jump into the previous of, do I think CROs are ever going to go away? And I do not think CROs will ever go away. Kind of talking about the complete decentralized model. Going to the complete decentralized model, which I just recently had a site selection visit for, the CRO is actually conducting the entire trial. The sites are going to go away.
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that. If I had a little stick here, I think I'd be voting thumbs down on that one. I see it as the same way. I can see the role of sites changing and more entities becoming sites, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I feel like there's always going to be a role for you guys to play. I mean, we've had COVID for a year now, and I think you said before the call, you guys are extremely busy, right? So obviously, some folks are still saying, even with all the trials becoming decentralized, they still seem to have a need for what you guys are doing.
I want to add one more thing. Yeah. Go ahead, Rebecca.
No, I was just going to say, I think there's a difference. There's the decentralized and the standpoint of maybe the monitors not coming on site and maybe the patients not coming on site so much because of a partial, remote capacity. But pre-COVID, there was a big push for decentralized trials for the patient standpoint. This was pre-COVID. And so those are the types of trials that I'm referring to where, like I said, even pre-COVID, that we would send a phlebotomist to them. They had e-diaries. We sent them, their IP or anything. So there's actually studies that are going on where the patients never leave their home, COVID or not COVID. So that's kind of when I refer to the decentralized trial from this standpoint, that's what I was referring to. Now, I agree. What COVID has done to us and kind of made a remote a little bit bigger of a picture, that's not going to affect the site.
Okay, go ahead, Chris. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I'd say, Rebecca, you're in one of those special situations where it appears truly you take very good care of your patients, but that isn't the case across the board with many other sites. And so when I come back to my IP illustration, we had situations where the patient never returned their IP. So we don't know if it was collected. We don't know officially how much they took it and that sort of thing. So to have it decentralized, and not have a high touch situation at the site for those sites that need to have a high touch, unlike yours, it gives me some pause.
And Chris, let me give you the last word on this one. Decentralized trials really went into effect in 2020 for the sake of patients. I think for years, people have been saying this is a way to make trials more patient-centric and allow patients to participate without having to make trips from work and from home to the clinic and so forth. And last year, of course, it was an effort to keep them safe and allow them to participate from home instead of going into a hospital or clinic. Now that we're a year into this, do you feel like patients are truly seeing the benefits that we hoped they would when we came up with this model?
Boy, the last word, that's tough. I believe we are moving in that direction. I truly do. We are clearly not there yet. Definitely not there yet. And again, so much depends on what I would call the PI, the principal investigator, and his or her site staff, and how they interface with the patient. If they have a wonderful connect and they can go on their iPad or something and establish that bond, that's fabulous. But sites are not, and I'm not fussing at Rebecca's side of the triumvirate here, but so much really depends on the site or that group that actually touches the patient to make it work. Thanks, Rebecca.
I'm all in support of that. Of course, from the site level, I don't want sites to go away. It makes me incredibly nervous. But it's interesting to see the push that some CROs are making.